Hi everyone, we're here another week on Mutant Watts, and today we're gonna talk about Grant Morrison's New X-Men, which ran from 2001 to 2004, like 20 years ago, and about the articles that Travis, who is here with us, is doing around examining the different things that went around in this run, its context, its themes, what the characters mean in both literal and like textual ways. And so that's what we're gonna be rolling today. And I think it's gonna be interesting, especially like for people interested in checking this run and like why this run could be important in this context. And I'm certainly one of them because I have only read things bits here and there, and I have never like read the whole run altogether. And I'm curious about asking Travis some questions. So would be mostly it, but Matt is here with us, also accompanying us, and Matt knows his comic history, so he's gonna help me with that. And Gabriel, who is right here, and I'm sure we'll have opinions. So,
I'm good at having opinions.
So first of all, and for starting somewhere, there's the first article that Travis does on this is about the contest, about what came before this run, and what is the contest of Marvel as a company and the X-Men as franchise in this moment. And I'm gonna let either Travis, Matt, both of you, roll with that one. Like, explain a little bit that.
Well, Travis, hey, this is your show. Go for it, my dude.
Well, I mean, I will admit up front, my chronology in both comics internally in terms of story and in terms of actual life gets really mixed up. So Matt, if I say anything, feel free to correct me or steer me in the right direction. But basically when New X-Men launched, or right before New X-Men launched, Marvel had gone bankrupt a couple years earlier. There had been a series of ownership issues with including owners who were very involved but not aware of what really made comics work or how comics worked. And so there was a lot of editorial conflict. There was an entire crossover that was forced within a couple of weeks because the then owner had visited Marvel and noticed a comic was being canceled without clearing up its subplots. And they were like, how can you just end without clearing up your subplots? And they made them take an entire swath of books and just make up a crossover. And so that crossover, which is Atlantis Rising, has 2 issues in it where the only part of the crossover is a character watching the tide level rise in the ocean a couple feet. That's the entire contribution to the crossover. And that's just because they had an owner who didn't know really what made a comic exciting or worth buying. So you had the bankruptcy issue. Grant Morrison was experiencing frustration at DC Comics at that time, coming off some very high profile runs, looking for something new. And they offered Morrison at the time a big chunk of the actual percentage of Marvel Comics. Marvel had not had the movie success or outside comic success that they've had since. They had toy lines and some cartoons that had been successful, but that was it. The X-Men movie was just coming up. And so it looked like a really good deal to jump into, I think, for Morrison, who did not take the percentage. They did not take the percentage. They worked out a contract that was kind of unheard of at the time in terms of writer control, which doesn't work out in the long run, but looked really good. The X-Men books at that time had a writer on Uncanny and X-Men. It was Alan Davis, who drew some of the issues, wrote most of them, or plotted. By his own admission, was not interested in the long run. Alan Davis had not wanted to. He'd wanted to jump on for a few issues and move over. He eventually is replaced, at first ghost writing by Chris Claremont, and then Chris Claremont is writing again both Uncanny and X-Men. Sales were not doing as good as they wanted to. They were starting to fall. Those runs are probably, for me, the most confusing runs of anything Chris Claremont has written. I don't know how to read those comics, and I think I'm not alone in that. A lot of the other...
If I can just quickly interject there.
Yeah.
Because I read this for the first time relatively recently, because that was such a fallow time for X-Men, the X-Men line, that I had, it's just at a point where I had checked out of reading X-Men, and so yeah, I go back and I revisit these Claremonts. Like, okay, I know they're not going to be great, whatever. It's still Claremont, but two things really strike me is they're just genuinely and generally very directionless. Like, one of the big things about Claremont's run is that there's always progressive narrative moving forward, plots, subplots, 30 subplots, relationships, and so on and so forth. And this book didn't have that. The other books, and then the other problem is he was still writing like it was still the 80s, and they're so exposition heavy and dialogue heavy, and they're honestly a slog to get through. Yeah, so go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying, yeah, no, definitely, it was a low bar time, even if you were a real X fan. The satellite titles were all experiencing different kinds of revamps. And so Cable, which is about a soldier from the future, had been revamped as a soldier who has no more war left. And it's this very meditational Eastern European philosophical comic, which is fantastic, but I don't know appealed to any Cable fans necessarily. Yeah. You had X-Force being reinvented as sort of this 60s spy pop thing that, again, didn't really appeal, and I think confused a lot of fans. The next X-Force revamp that's alongside New X-Men is going to confuse them even more. So it's not about quality in these cases. Some of these comics, like Soldier X, I really like. That X-Force run, I really enjoy. But I also understand when X-Force fans who had been reading the last 50 or whatever 100 issues were confused or put off. So the X brand was kind of in a rut and very confused and directionless. And when Morrison came on, they made it very clear. They wrote out what's called the Morrison Manifesto, which is a long document that just sorts out everything has become sectic, everything has become incestuous and confusing. And it shouldn't be, because all of these characters are cool and this comic used to be cool. Here's how we can basically do the old comic, but make it look new. And they also designed the logo, the new X-Men logo, so that it can be flipped upside down and it still reads, well, you can see here, the logo here was designed so that you could flip it upside down and it's still new X-Men. And they were like, basically, this book should stand out on the stands no matter how it is. If the book is stacked up against other books, if the issue is on somebody's coffee table and upside down, they should be able to see this is a new X-Men issue, whatever direction they're looking at it, and know this is a comic, specific comic. So there was a real design ethic, I think, from the ground up that X-Men hadn't had probably since Jim Lee in the 90s, where it was very design first, right? Those new the Jim Lee launch of the comic that becomes New X-Men, just X-Men, that first issue or first 3 issues, those covers look great. You know exactly what you're going for. And we really hadn't had that. We basically had nostalgia buys for 10 years in a big way. And it's not bad necessarily. I think, at the time, at the beginning of that sold really well. But by the time of New X-Men, it had completely stopped. Yeah.
Yes, Percy. So talking a bit about that rebranding, I want to ask you, like, how do you think, like, this Morrison plan about doing the same thing but different, like how that was planned? Like mostly your second article goes into how it was rebranded, what was the plan for rebranding, what was their vision for the book, and that's I think a good introduction too.
So like I said, the Morrison Manifesto, they really lay out that you've got to use these characters, you've got to use these settings or situations, but we can modernize them. And I think one of the biggest was they wanted to move the book away from being about right-wing bigotry or conservative, capsy conservative bigotry, and make it about liberal bigotry, and make it about people that are aging out or feel like they're aging out, and about nerd or geek bigotry, which was a big problem that was generating at the time that I think a lot of us didn't realize, and may have even, a lot of comics fans were contributing to without realizing. This blows up later when one of the artists on New X-Men, is foundational with Comicsgate. And that was the sort of thing that I think the comic was predicting, was rather than having a right-wing preacher who is a conservative Republican come out, it's comics nerds that are going to be bigoted and, not even low-key jealous, but just jealous of mutants or jealous of people having success. And that sort of self-loathing combined with, I can take it out on somebody else. And so it was kind of reworking those old groups, like the Friends of Humanity become essentially the U-Men. And the U-Men kind of want to co-opt everything that's about mutant and like, see, we're like mutants too, but it's all directed towards this just Nazi ideology. Characters were brought back in and kind of pared back. So early in the issues, especially, there's a lot of, early in the run, there's a lot of callbacks to earlier comics to appeal to older fans or familiar fans, but they're not necessary in any way for us to get. In those early issues, there's nothing from a year before or 30 years before that you have to read or feel that you have to read to understand this storyline. A lot of the storylines in New X-Men only last a few months. Virtually nothing lasts longer than 1 year. So 12 issues and you're out of a storyline if it's a long arc. Compared to previous runs, starting with the Claremont stuff where subplots could go on for decades or may just never get answered. There are old subplots that they would just drag on forever because the subplot was what they were convinced we were interested in, not that it ever becomes a plot. Sexuality and globalization were addressed, I think, in new ways, or it tried to be modern. 9/11 and the subsequent U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, our re-invasion of Iraq, and so on, really affect some of those plans. There were plans like Dust, who is a character that they find in Afghanistan, and we don't really know if she's from Afghanistan or if she's from somewhere else because she doesn't speak a language that is common in Afghanistan. So there are issues with this. Morrison consciously drops that character back because when the character was plotted and planned, none of that stuff in the real world had happened yet. And a lot of this Islamophobic stuff going on in the US had not been a thing to that level. And so they didn't know how to make that work in the limited pages that they had, keeping the other plots. And so that character just gets dropped back. So there are some things they intended to do that get pulled back that way. There is a part during the Bachalo arc that had been in the pitch and had been pushed. They were working towards getting Wolverine, at the time Gambit, and Cyclops drunk and having them wake up drunk, hopefully just in bed together. And they don't know what happened. They don't know whatever. And then they go on this adventure. And what you have in the book instead is this subplot about two British journalists, or I think a British and American journalist, investigating this scientific experiment in England. And it's cool. It's a fun scene. It's an interesting scene, but it's obviously a scene that was stapled into the comic because they had to remove this sequence that maybe would have soft outed some sexuality with characters. So I think there was more planned in terms of representation than we get, but we do get a push. Jean Grey at the front, Emma Frost really kind of, people always want to credit Morrison with making Emma Frost a superhero and bringing her into the X-Men as a positive character, like she hadn't had 10 years already with Generation X and other things. I think that's a testament in a way to how good the influence was there, because people really feel like that was her coming into her own or coming into not being a supervillain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And it certainly puts Emma front and center in a way that even being one of the leads in Generation X did not.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to take a point of something you said, because one of the things that I like a lot about one of your articles, I think is the 21st Century one, probably, I'm not sure, or if it's another one earlier, is that you talk about how comics after 9/11 generally tend towards militarization, like, for example, The Dark Knight Rises, like tend towards glorifying militarization, or like pushing a look at how militarization is actually kind of cool, and that was a thing, and how New X-Men was pretty much not that, and was also like very critical of like most things that happen in the book that are like massive shows of force are also shown as bad. They're shown as something that strikes characters, that is like making them feel like wrong, that is effectful. So it feels more like a push against militarization after 9/11 than other thing, and that's something that you kind of touched a bit on it. So I want to ask you about that, because that's something that really interests me in the book.
No, I mean, that was something, and I remember at the time, during that, we were shooting a lot of air shows and some other military things at the time, and they would always try to pitch you on, if you join, you're not going to be in there on the ground floor. They'll give you a rank and blah, 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 and officer training, blah, blah, blah. And it was this hard, it was the hard sell era because everybody was going overseas and dying. And so when I look at New X-Men now, I think about back then, and everybody I knew was either involved in military somehow, even if you weren't military, like I wasn't military, but I was working for the military all the time, or you were involved in porn. And that was kind of the big porn explosion, was because the internet, you could suddenly have porn, and like all my friends were in porn. I worked at a gentleman's club for a while as a ringer at the time, where they would give me a stack of bills and I would just flirt with my friends and make the guys who came in jealous. And then they want to spend more money because they want to get attention. And it was this that was what like everybody was doing. It was this sort of, you can get hired to do audition porn was the big thing where I was in Southern California at the time. And so that's how I look at New X-Men now. I look at that kind of burgeoning sexuality or burgeoning kind of, porno vibe that a lot of the elements have, and also the militarization. And I realized like those are kind of the same thing. They were recruitment things in both cases. And it was this, we need them young and we need them naive and we need them, passionate, or that they feel they have a duty, and then you kind of slough them off. And so looking at New X-Men, when you have militarization there, like Phantom X and Eva are basically draft dodgers. When we meet them, we are told that that she is just a vehicle and that he is a French super thief. And we're sort of played on that. And then when we get their origin, it's that they're essentially the same person in two bodies. Eva is his nervous system, who has come out of his body, and like an EVA, her name is spelled EVA, which is when you leave, like you're an astronaut and you leave the rocket ship and go out and do something. That's an EVA. And so her, as a nervous system coming out of his mouth, she's literally left the rocket ship of the body of Phantom X. And they are draft dodgers. They were being raised to come of age and join this military program, which was going to be used to fight mutants and ostensibly to genocide mutants, although really the purpose of it is the commerciality of militarization. They're not really going to ever win this genocide thing. They're supposed to get on TV and look good on TV fighting mutants. And Phantom X and Eva run away from that. They basically dodge the draft. And so this is probably the most prominent draft dodging story in a Marvel superhero comic ever. Other military that show up, there's somebody in there in a really satirical scene, which some people took issue with because it was so satirical. They ask for a volunteer from an international, we're not sure if they're really military, if they're paramilitary, because there's French, British, and American, soldiers there. And they ask for somebody, and this guy volunteers. They said they want a soldier who has no compassion, no thoughts of his own at all, no care for himself. And Corporal Animal volunteers, and that's his name, literally, his Corporal Animal. And he's gritting his teeth and his eyes are popping and so on. And after a few seconds with Charles Xavier and Jean Grey, he has reconsidered his whole life and realizes that when his father was mean to him as a child, he built walls around his heart and he should reevaluate his life and all this. And I only recently realized Corporal Animal is Wolverine. Corporal Animal is a character who was traumatized in childhood, became militarized, and considers himself a heartless killing machine who has animal frenzy and won't stop. I said, that's Wolverine. And so I looked at it that way and I realized Corporal Animal I felt very sympathetic to now for what he's gone through, but also Wolverine, when they want to stop Wolverine at the end. In most X-Men comics, the way we see Wolverine stopped is throw all of his enemies at him, right? Throw 1 billion enemies at him, and that might slow him down, or pour adamantium over him, right? And then the unbreakable metal will be solid and he can't get loose. It's a very physical sort of confrontation. In New X-Men, they make Wolverine suicidal and make him stop everything by showing him documents that we have no reason to believe, and he really has no reason to believe, but they say that all he is a killing machine designed to kill other mutants. They basically make up a document, show it to him. It says, you are a sentinel. And his response to that is to try to kill himself out in space. And Jean Grey comes and convinces him it's okay. And he dies anyway, right? They die and she resurrects him and herself. But that's a very different way to approach how do you stop Wolverine? How do you stop an unkillable killing machine? Is just tell him he's a killing machine. Just tell him that's all he's there for. That's what he's good for. And so there's a real pacifist strain there. There's a very strong anti-military strain. Morrison's father had joined the military, as many people in his generation did. He refused to participate in what he saw as genocidal actions when he was a soldier, and ended up in jail for it. He ended up in jail as a dissenter. And they were pretty harsh to him, as I understand it. He was in solitary. He was beaten quite severely. He spent the rest of his life protesting, particularly nuclear warfare and nuclear armament. But it really, so these were things that I think are very close to Grant Morrison that came out and really flowered in New X-Men. To me, more than they flower anywhere else in their body of work.
Travis, you were talking about, or you sort of alluded to through lines in Morrison's body of work, and one thing they've always been very fashion conscious. You definitely saw it in Invisibles, and one of the things that's most striking about New X-Men is the team is not dressing in spandex anymore. Mm-hmm. They have cool jackets and not necessarily the militarized vibe, but there's a fashion element happening to it. I mean, the book itself, and thanks in no small part to Frank Quitely's astounding art and design sense, the book just had a look to it that nothing else at the time did. What do you think about Morrison and fashion and X-Men?
I think it was definitely fashion conscious, definitely fashion forward. And at the time, extreme sports had become this big thing. And I think that plays into it. They look much more like they're going to go jump on, motorcycles or something than they're going to go fight a war. And a lot of the other books at the time, it was very military fashion. It was not pouches again, but it was lots of belts and belt buckles on everything. And we don't have that. We have very slick lines. That first cover that you showed where they're in silhouette, I remember John Byrne complaining about that cover because it was just silhouettes and it was just shapes, and how lazy it was that it was just shapes. And I was like, well, it's going to stand out much more than whatever he had on the stands at the time.
I'll just throw out that John Byrne has absolutely no cred to be saying any other artist is lazy.
So, to me, it's like it really stood out. I think those block shapes, and that it scared a lot of fans, was very interesting to me, and I think made more people read it than turned people off. I know people complained at the time, but they still bought the comic, and they still recognized, they still saw the comic. And looking at it now, those costumes are not a million miles away from the original X-Men costumes. They're probably closer to the original X-Men costumes than any other X-Men costumes, because they're the original X-Men costumes were yellow and blue, but the blue was like Spider-Man blue. It's coded as black. They just can't afford that much black ink. So it's yellow and blue costumes. And with new X-Men, they're yellow and black, but they're essentially very close to the same silhouette, the same breakdown. So calling back to that in a big way. But they all looked great. They were almost uniform, but they looked different. Everybody has their own jacket or their own collar on it, and these different sorts of things. And they start to mix and match. At one point, when Cyclops runs away because he has been found out he's having an affair with Emma Frost, he steals Wolverine's motorcycle and he steals his wife's coat to run away. And it's this great sort of thing where, like, in a way, he's cosplaying these two people that he really looks up to for strength. I don't think that's conscious. I don't think Scott Summers was like, oh my God, I've been found out, went immediately and was like, I need to be Wolverine and my wife. But in terms of representation, he immediately went for something of Wolverine's and something of Jean's, and then went and got drunk trying to think, how do I be a stronger person? And I think that's very clear in that way. There's always been a sense in Morrison's work of dress revealing who you are, but also dress that can maybe make you somebody else, or help you ease into something else. And I think that comes into New X-Men in a big way, both with clothes and names. When Quentin Quire's little group, his gang, which they call the Omega Skulls in everything else, but that's nowhere in New X-Men. In New X-Men, what they call themselves is the New X-Men. That's it. And so that's what they are. And it's this group of teenage fascists, basically, who have decided to dress up in these uniforms and call themselves the New X-Men, and then they just will be. And they'll be baddest mofos on the planet, kind of thing. It doesn't work, but they feel like it, right? Especially feels like he is Charles Xavier now. He's just better than Charles, because they have these fancy costumes and they have this cool name. And it's very brand oriented that way. There's a character named John Sublime who turns out to be humans who are possessed by an algae or a mold that has been the ultimate villain of everybody since before there were other life forms. This is the first life form on Earth, and it's very upset with us, basically, for our pretensions. And in the comic, they will specifically possess these people and imitate them, or control them, I mean to say, that are designed to look like Tom Cruise for the most part. We find out that they are wearing hair plugs and there are other things going on. But several times when John Sublime shows up, they just drew Tom Cruise in the comic. And that's a very aware, very conscious thing, you know, to have that image and promote that, because even if we don't recognize Tom Cruise, we bring some of our feelings about Tom Cruise into that design, you know, into our read of that, into our understanding of that. Things like we bring with a toupee or something, we bring an idea in how we judge hair plugs, or how we judge Emma Frost for her running or her other surgical work, right? There are different ways that different readers read into that. And some will judge her very strict, you know, very harshly. You know, she changed everything about herself, or she's mutilated herself in some way. And the John Sublime character kind of plays into that. And then we find out that he's even more artificial than anyone. There are other aspects of that where things are very surgical, or things are about confidence. A lot of the characters in New X-Men have spent New X-Men or spent their childhood before just finding their confidence, finding their pride. Phantom X says at one point, everybody's looking for their pride, their confidence. His is in being Phantom X. His is in this myth that he is a French thief that never existed. It's not a real thing, but it makes him feel like he can, you know, lift his head up and go out in the morning. And so that's what he is. Emma Frost had, you know, cosmetic work done, or Cyclops dealing with his eyes and, you know, that he can't take his glasses off ever, or he might hurt people, that kind of thing. So they all have these different things that they're dealing with, that they kind of crafted identities that are visual and psychological and reputational over.
So just about the thing, like the thing you're talking about, their identities and like their bodies and all that stuff, it's for the people that are watching, specifically in the article that is about bodies, sexualities and souls. And that, about that one, I want to ask you a little bit about these things about the characters, but I also want to ask you, like, specifically about Emma Frost, because I'm aware that there is like a trans reading of Emma Frost there.
Yes.
And I'm curious for you to expand on that, especially because I didn't pick up that when I read the book. So like,
so in a scene, Emma Frost revealed as she looked when she was much younger, and have kind of a impressionistic version of her body being worked on. Like when she is remembering, along with Jean Grey, having surgical work done and she's unconscious, her body isn't just her body unconscious, it is completely shapeless and doughy. So it's not meant to represent real reality that way. There are other insets of musculature or unskinned flesh, one part of which several people thought looked like a penis. And they were wondering, and so there has been, since that issue came out, this reading that Emma Frost is trans, and that even her memories when we see her younger and she looks a certain way, just like when she looks doughy, we don't know that those are real, you know, photographic memories. Those could easily be her self-image or her idea of herself at those ages. And so let me see if I can find the images here. I flipped almost to it in it. I'm pretty impressed. I was only a few off. If we can see it. So if we can hold up close enough, that down here is her asleep. And so you can see it's incredibly impressionistic. We're not meant to think that she was really like a doughy form at that time. And let me see if I can find the other.
Travis, which issue is that?
That is, it is Let me see if I can find the title. I think that's Shattered because she gets shot at the end. So that's, yes, that is the comic that is titled Shattered. And I cannot find the other image now. But anyway, so that started a whole reading there at the time and has flowered since. And people have all sorts of evidence or incidentals to support this. And of course, other people get super mad that you even address the idea and how dare you. And, you know, we don't, one of the things I really like with X-Men comics is that we don't know a lot for sure in general, because we have seen characters in the X-Men comics supposedly affect us. Charles Xavier has turned his powers on the audience before. Rogue, when she was a teenager, had what is clearly coded as her first girlfriend, who was a character code named Blind Spot. And Blind Spot not only makes Rogue and Mystique and I can't think of Mystique's wife's name now, but you know, I'm Destiny. Irene, forget her. But she also makes the audience, she made us forget that she was ever there, which is why we don't remember when she's introduced. And so there's an aspect to X-Men where we can look back at issues and say, even if we saw it on panel, we don't really know we saw it on panel. We've seen illusions on panel. We've seen Mastermind look like a movie star on panels. It doesn't mean he actually looked like that. But in New X-Men, they really play with this in terms like when there's an issue where Emma Frost and Jean Grey go inside of Charles's mind, which has been booby-trapped inside of his twin sister's brain. And they see a lot of things in there. They see castles, and they see cruciform imagery and an ocean of sperm. And they also see a sequence where Charles, as a baby in the womb, as a fetus, supposedly tries to kill his sister and causes his mother to fall down a flight of stairs and somehow miscarry one of them. And we find out later in dialogue that this probably never happened, or at least never happened this way. It's a thing that makes Charles feel so guilty that he can't fight back, that he can't process this, alongside imagery about his disabilities and other imagery related to his mother and kind of Oedipal stuff in there. There's a snow globe where he has very clearly married his mother, standing there in a figure with her like this in the snow globe. That these are meant to arrest Charles. They're not meant to be, oh, this really happened, right? He totally, when he was 20, married his mother in Top Hat and Tails. Like, no, we know it never happened. And so there's a lot of imagery or a lot of visuals in New X-Men that are not meant to be taken literally. The final arc of New X-Men, which takes place 150 years in the future, at one point, Charles' sister, Cassie Nova, looks right at the reader. She turns away from everybody else to look at the reader, and she says, "I've had dreams about you. And I know that none of this future that is in the imaginary future," says, "I know none of this was supposed to happen." And of course, by the end of the arc, it's been removed because it was never supposed to happen. So anything that we're seeing in New X-Men is really open to interpretation. There are scenes that start out in psychic realms and then move to reality, and they're very consciously blurred. Like when Scott Summers learns that his wife knows he's having an affair, when we start that scene, he's in a different physical place. He's outside in a garden. In his mind, in the imaginary psychic part, they're in a bedroom that doesn't really exist. When Jean finds them, they're in Emma's bedroom, in the mansion, in the school. And when he walks out, he sees other characters leave him. They make fun of him. These teenagers make fun of him for being a kid, basically. And then they walk away, and they walk right into a wall. They're not walking down a hall. They're not walking to a door. They walk right into a hall. And they never address what part of that is psychic, what part of that is reality, whose psychic, vision or whatever is it. Imagination, psychic, whatever, and physical reality are all very blurred in New X-Men. in ways that they will never address directly.
So on that note, I also want to ask you about Beast, because like about both the redesign and the fact that this run plays with his sexuality a bit, which is something that, to my knowledge, hasn't happened yet since then. So
there was an incident with another comic after New X-Men where they do try to address it in a way that is very offensive. And it involves a writer who has since been disgraced as very abusive and very corrupt. So you can make your guesses there. And if you want to revisit that run, which is a very short run, you can see where the issue is. I don't want to get into it now because maybe it was meant well, but it's a very ugly way to approach somebody having said I'm gay. And so pushing that aside, as far as I know, no one else has addressed it at all. It meant a lot to me at the time. Beast in general in this run meant a lot to me at the time. I was in my early 20s. I was on hormones and having hormone issues. I was depressed, chronically depressed, and Beast opens up and disabled. I'm bobbing today up and down a bit because I have the worst leg cramps, like you don't believe. And so my legs keep jerking up and down. So Beast opens up New X-Men saying, basically, I'm disabled. I can't use my hands anymore. I'm manic depressed. I am, all of these things. And I'm hormonal and I feel like a Hindu sex god. And this is the whole... And that to me at the time was like, that's what life feels like. This is whole uncertainty of your own body and of your emotions and reactions. And, in the run, Beast is very prone to crying almost out of nowhere or getting very depressed out of nowhere. And it was like, yeah, I know that. I recognize it. Yes. And so that sort of thing was really grounded there. That comes out of older arcs. Louise Simonson always wrote Beast as someone who had chronic depression. And especially towards the end of her run, or when he meets Trish Tilby for the first time, his girlfriend at the beginning of New X-Men, he's incredibly depressed. That's all that is. They couldn't use the words, and for whatever reason, or didn't use the words. And I know Morrison puts bipolar right in there. And so that is a difference there. But a lot of these things have been pre-existing, and I think were just kind of brought out by somebody who was maybe more conscious of identifying emotional issues or psychological issues, chemical and hormonal issues in that way. Morrison since then has had several characters use medication to take care of depression or anxiety in their comics, which is a rarity in comics. One of the things that really bothers me with Magneto and revisiting this arc has been that Magneto was established as bipolar 30 years ago, and I haven't seen anyone really do anything with that. There's no attempt at a treatment or, whether that's medical or whatever, or even an acknowledgement of it in anything else. So I really appreciate that Morrison brought these things to the fore. In terms of them saying, I think I might be gay. They say, I think they say at first, I don't think I'm interested in a relationship with a human being right now, or with a human right now, meaning not a mutant or something else. And then they say, I think I might be gay. And they admit later they were trying to snap back at their ex, who, because she is a journalist, just took it and made it a news story. But they don't deny that they're gay, and they refuse to. Their close friends refuse to acknowledge it at all. Scott Summers, Cyclops, is like, I've known you forever, and you're just going to go and have a nervous breakdown if you keep saying this. Which is the worst way to respond to your friend when your friend says, I think I'm gay or I think I'm queer. The worst thing you can say is, like, as your oldest friend, that's going to really depress you. Like, that's not a good idea. So it's I think his friends, his colleagues handle it worse. The press handles it worse. The comic itself refuses to say Beast is not gay or that Beast is not queer. The closest we come is Emma Frost saying, I know you've never had a sexual relationship with another man. That's what she says, which is a different thing, right? You can be gay and not have had sex with another person of the same gender yet or ever, right? That doesn't really mean anything. It means it might mean you're closeted. It might just mean you haven't had sex or haven't had sex in a while. So that's as far as the comic will go. If Morrison intended to queer Beast permanently and outly and then had to back off, I don't know. It feels like that was a storyline that was set up to be a little bit more and then kind of gets pushed back as things go along. So my inclination is that was going to be a bigger storyline. It really bothered a lot of people at the time on all sides. It was an issue kind of on all sides. And a lot of it was, well, Beast has never been shown to be gay or shown to be queer. Same thing we saw with Iceman, 10 years later or however long afterwards it was. And I came to X-Men from New Defenders. That's where I came to X-Men. I followed the original X-Men from New Defenders to X-Factor, basically, and then kind of to the other titles, because most of the X-Men titles at the time, they just kind of confused me, or I wasn't sure where I sat with things. When it came to Uncanny X-Men, the Colossus Kitty thing always bothered me, and then Colossus had his child in the Savage Land, but they can't talk to each other, and then he goes to space and he has sex with another woman who he can't talk to, and like this creeped me out as a kid. So really Colossus kept me out of Uncanny X-Men as a kid. X-Factor was confusing to me because in the early issues, Scott Summers was having all the guys lie to Jean Grey, his ex, that he doesn't have a wife. And like as a kid, this was really weird to me. Like I didn't really understand the whole, this is cheating without having sex. Like I didn't know the politics of it. It was just weird that your friends all lied to you. And so I didn't really get into those early, when I should have been getting into X-Men, it always pushed me out. But New Defenders had 3 of the original X-Men, and you could get back issues really cheap. That was a title that was always a quarter bin title. And so that was where I was at. And that was the queerest comic Marvel published in the 80s. Everybody got to be queer in that. Cloud had 2 human forms, one male, one female. They were both Cloud. And Iceman was dating Cloud, but very uncomfortable whenever they would become male. And then you had Moondragon calling him a coward for that, and he needed to face up to himself, which in retrospect is a whole different thing than it was at the time. At the time, that was you need to get over, it's the same person. Now it's like you need to get over the male aspect because we know. So there was a lot going on. Moondragon was equally attracted to both the male and female forms, but also had other issues. Moondragon had issues with her own femininity or her own gender identity. There was a lot of sexual politics going on with these characters. And so Beast was in there. Iceman was in there. Iceman used to get so jealous when guys would pay attention or girls would pay attention to Beast or to Angel that Iceman would lie and be like, I'm their boyfriend. And literally that's the word he was, I'm their boyfriend. And he would put his arm around whichever one of them and steer them away. And so to me, these characters coming out of New Defenders, or the way that Beast was in Avengers, where he was very flamboyant in Avengers, and this kind of swinging, touchy-feely guy. Right before New X-Men, he shows up in Avengers for a cameo where he kisses Wonder Man on the mouth in that issue. And then he comes over like 3 months later, he's like, I think I might be gay. And I was like, well, okay, I'm perfectly fine with this. I feel like a lot of X-Men fans, in the same way that a lot of Batman fans came through the Batman animated series or a movie, a lot of X-Men fans at the time came through the animated series. And so their vision of Beast is a serious voiced man who holds a book and has philosophical thoughts. And maybe sometimes he will do it upside down. And that's all of Beast. And Comics Beast was never that guy. Comics Beast was very physically open and very loud and flamboyant, and he liked to kiss people and hug people and wear flashy clothes and dance around. It was not unusual to see Beast dance with another man or kiss another man on the lips. These are things that happened in comics before New X-Men. And so Beast saying, I'm exploring this, or I'm not sure about this, was like, well, okay, you know. They are canonically at that time in their mid-20s or late 20s, because Emma's older and Emma's only 27, which puts the original X-Men probably in their late 20s at that time. Mid to late 20s at most. Which makes sense in a way. X-Men ages are really weird because they keep introducing younger generation, but they're not that far apart. So that's a perfectly normal or perfectly reasonable time. So to me, I was completely there for it. Other people on both sides were not. Queer people felt cheated that this was a character who had not, had any demonstration of anything, or they weren't going to go anywhere with it. And other people were upset because they're turning all the characters gay, which they keep promising me and has not happened yet. They keep telling me every character in the Marvel Universe is going to be, trans and gay and of color and whatever. And I'm waiting. I will happily await that day.
Travis, there's more to with Beast going on though that definitely ties in with something that you touched on earlier with Morrison's how do I put this, your outer self vis-a-vis, or your inner self filtered through your outer self. I could not spit that out. But with Beast, it's literal. Like, he literally transforms his body to become more feline, and what if anything should people of the trans community take from that?
Beast is definitely, especially in this run, the body dysmorphia is a huge issue. And that's tied up with representation in a lot of ways. And the way that friends respond to that are not necessarily the healthiest, but it is the way your friends often respond. I hate the way I look. I feel uncomfortable in my body. I feel nervous about this. Oh, you look great. You look beautiful. You look handsome. You look whatever. That's not what they're saying, but we're trained societally to respond that way. And so it comes mostly from positive places, but it doesn't really help. And it makes Beast very vulnerable. There are times where villains are able to get the better of him just kind of by playing on his looks and his concern about that. So I think it's a dangerous line, or a very thin line to walk. It's a real tightrope sort of thing. Morrison has talked about wanting Beast to be representative of body dysmorphia for trans people, for people that are concerned about their weight in one direction or the other. And we see in an early issue that Beast is drinking diet cola while everybody else is just having cola because they're worried about getting too fat. And, when was the last time we saw any superhero with this kind of concern? And it's not in a, they're fat way, right? Which has turned into Ms. Marvel, the whole Ms. Marvel is fat meme that won't die. It really was a concern of, this is something Beast is worried about all the time, even though they look like a giant cat and they used to look like, I never saw the monkey thing. I know Beast was supposed to look like a monkey, quote unquote, for years. That I've never seen a monkey that looked like that. It always looked a little more cat-like with the little pointy things and all this. And so, but anyway, the different forms that they've had, and before that, it was just huge hands and huge feet, and they used to make fun of that. And so there's a lot of that. There's also disability and being embarrassed about your disability. There's a part where Beast breaks down because they can't hold a screwdriver with their paw anymore. And Jean has to come over and help, but they literally just knock everything over, then cry again. And, you know, I've been there. I throw things down a lot because of my CP. I have other issues. And so I think a lot of people were able to see themselves in that, but there's also a chance that you will see yourself and be offended, or that you will see what you don't see in yourself in that and be offended. And so part of that is the fantastic part of it, the fantasy part of it. I have a very uncomfortable relationship with fantastic bigotry or with fantasy representation of any real human aspect. I think it can be very powerful and it can be very helpful, but it is always also damaging. It's impossible, I think, to have a fantastic element represent a real element and have it not be damaging on some level. And so if Beast is the out queer one of the X-Men, they're also the non-human looking one of New X-Men. That's who came out, was the one that doesn't look human anymore. There's a comic from X-Men Unlimited that is reprinted in an omnibus that is called The New X-Men Companion. The New X-Men Companion is humiliating. There's one comic in it that I really like, and then there are 400 other pages that are the most TNA, outdated, useless sort of representation of X-Men that could possibly have come out at the same time as New X-Men. One of those stories, Beast falls in love. He falls in love with a comatose patient who, again, is comatose, and he's like super into her, who turns out not to be a mutant, not to be human, not to be an alien. It's a house cat that looks like a humanoid cat. That's who he's horny for. And when she wakes up, he's trying to rehabilitate her and communicate, and he's dreaming of this life together. That's what's going on in other X-Men comics at the same time that Morrison is dealing with this, I think I might be queer, is, oh, well, then he might be wanting to have sex with a house cat. And that's the problem with fantastic representation. They wouldn't do that with another character because they don't look like a cat. The reason, I don't remember who wrote that story, I don't remember who drew it, but the reason they did that story is because the character looks like a cat. And it wouldn't have occurred to them to do that with, Iceman or Angel or somebody. So I think that's always damaging.
I mean, to be honest with that you just said, and Beauty and the Beast, I'm convinced that Beast is gay because those stories make no sense from a romantic perspective.
Yeah. No,
it's just overcompensating at that point.
I mean, I've been shipping him and Wonder Man as long as I've been alive, basically. They always have the most difficult relationships with anyone else, and they're based in that mutual depression or mutual Wonder Man and his imposter. Well, I guess they both have imposter syndrome. And so, so I really appreciate that Morrison made an effort to not just cut that off and say, oh, it was a lie, or oh, it was wrong. That even if they just let it peter out, I would rather that. And I don't know what kind of pressures there were at that time. You look at other comics that are going on at the time, and it was, in a sexual way, a very, again, conservative fashion. I look back at even before, just in the late 70s, the late 90s, like 97, 96, 94. And you had some really strong queer stories, or even just casual gay couples that I completely forgot about. If you read the Ian Egginton Blade series that came out in the late 70s, there's a lesbian couple in that first arc. And I was like, there's just a lesbian couple there. Like, that was really, they got that one through. There was a really powerful lesbian story about a character who all the characters are dead and they're in hell, and they're because of their own guilt and their own issues. And one of them is guilty. All she's guilty about is that she's gay. But it has, the whole thing is her climbing out of hell, basically, and trying to realize, like, even if you spent your life closeted and you did everything you could to not be gay, none of that's hell-worthy. None of that's your fault. And that came out in Len Kaminsky's Hellstorm run in the 90s.
Oh, it was early 90s.
Yeah. And so by the time we get to New X-Men, and X-Force had the first male gay kiss on that was definitely 2 gay characters, human, characters and so on. And those characters then die like panels later, and everybody died in that run.
Yes.
But they die immediately. That was kind of where they were at. If you look at the Ultimates is homophobic, it's racist, it's sexist. That was the biggest selling. That was the title they were promoting everywhere. And you can say all you want, well, it was a joke or it was comedic, but that's not the way they talked about it. It's not the way they talk about it now. It's not the way they talked about it then. They meant it. They may have had their tongue in their cheek a little bit, oh, dumb Americans buying this, but they meant it. And so even that it petered out, I have a lot of forgiveness for that. I can't really point a finger and say this, somebody made this call, because I don't know who made the call.
So now that we're talking about complicated things, I thought it should be a moment in here to bring up Magneto in New X-Men, because like this is not my favorite Magneto. Like, I'm gonna be honest, he's not my favorite Magneto here. But I'm curious on your take, because I have read like, while editing you, I'm always curious of what you say about Magneto. I usually like search Magneto first to see if you have something to say, because I'm curious, because this is like very return to the 60s Magneto in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Like, he gets really, really there. And I'm honestly prefer Claremont's, but I'm curious about, because it's not exactly a return. It's like an integration of both things.
Yes.
So,
well, and I think we all really, in ways, preferred Claremont's. We all missed Claremont's. One of the ways that there's a couple ways that I think that run really shows how much we missed good Claremont Magneto. One way is that we talk about Morrison turning Magneto back to a villain. That's a common thing for X fans to talk about. Magneto had been committing genocide after genocide or crucifying heroes since 1991, right? Adjective-less X-Men that becomes New X-Men opens with Magneto as the villain, committing, atrocious things and torturing people. That's the return of big villain Magneto. That's 10 years earlier. And since then, we had Magneto commit genocide after genocide, an EMP pulse around the world that kills hundreds, if not thousands, of people in hospitals and elevators and vehicles, while leading a genocidal cult. Right before New X-Men, there is an arc by Scott Lobdell, and I forget the name of the arc. It crosses over between a few titles. And in that arc, he crucifies... Thank you. He crucifies Charles Xavier in that arc just for disagreeing with him. He is ready to commit mass murder again. He is frothing at the mouth and has that spit thing hanging from his mouth that some artists love to draw and I never understand. So there's a whole 10 years of Magneto being this big villain before Morrison gets there. Yeah. What Morrison does is knock him off the page, make him a t-shirt and a logo, and all the children admire him. The older generation mostly want to talk good about him. They get pushed a little bit and they have to say something. Okay, well, he also killed people, or he also, had child armies or whatever. But they want to say nice things about him, like he was kind to animals. And we see that in New X-Men, where when there's the street scene in the riot, who he goes to protect is not the humans or the mutants. Who he goes to protect is the police force. And we see Magneto cradling, like Nietzsche, going to save the horse, which they then used to incriminate him and his sister, the Nazi, kind of overs on Nietzsche's career and his works. That's how that happened, right? He saw a horse being beaten in the street and he freaked out that they're beating the shit out of this horse. And so that's what we see with Magneto in that sequence. All the words that he writes down in the journal he gives to Charles is lies. And what his other actions are, we don't know. But one thing we do see him do is go protect that horse. So yeah, he's kind to animals. But he also kills people, and he also, et cetera, et cetera. So they take him off the board. make him a t-shirt. They make him a memory. They make people try to, work out things. The 9/11 message that we get as a big 9/11 message comes from Magneto. It's Magneto's soliloquy, right? It's Magneto talking there, recording. And everyone's so moved by that they stand in the sunset as the sun sets behind them. And the whole world listens to Magneto talk about terrorism and murder. And so we're built up in that way. And we get Zorn, and everybody likes Zorn because Zorn is friendly and caring, and he's like hippy dippy, and he's dopey. The kids hang a kick me sign on his back, and he was in jail for 40 years for something he didn't do. And it turns out that, spoiler, Zorn is Magneto, and all the stuff we like about Zorn was Magneto making fun of the X-Men and making fun of us. Really, anything that we liked with Zorn or we thought was cute or caring or heartfelt is Magneto just making fun of us.
It's a pretty epic troll.
Yeah. And I think that
like 20 years later.
I think it really hurt a lot of people's feelings. And a lot of the reason some readers still won't accept that it's true is it really hurt everybody. And we didn't want Magneto back that way. We didn't want walk down or fly down the middle of Manhattan, murdering everybody with his mutant army or his whatever army Magneto back. And he's never come back, right? We have not had, I don't know what the upcoming arc is going to be. The Trial of Magneto is the new arc, right? Is that it?
Yes.
I don't know what crime he committed, if he's committed it yet or whatever, considering they let like Sebastian Shaw and Sinister in on the government. I don't think they can judge Magneto here, but
yeah, that's kind of the question before the court because it hasn't happened yet. But like, wait, you had Apocalypse on your inner circle, my dude. I mean,
but we've had.
I mean, but Sabretooth killed like 2 people, and that was very bad.
Yeah, but we've had 20 years now of Magneto, who is not a great guy. Magneto's still not a great human being. And he still committed a lot of these crimes, but he's not this bug-eyed, raving, upset, I have to murder people today guy. And that, I think, really was part of that arc was not meant to be that malicious. Morrison will admit now that arc went really dark because they were really upset and really depressed. And they very famously quit New X-Men publicly at a convention, losing their temper. They didn't mean to quit right then. There were other plans. The X-Men were going to get more superhero again with Cyclops taking over. There were ways to flip this and have a whole new storyline. And they got really upset, and they called Bill Jemas, I think, the biggest asshole in the world or something like that. And I quit. And that was that. That was, well, it's done now. And they've said they came around when they did the final arc, and they felt much better about the final arc. But that arc goes really dark because they were really upset and they were really tired, and it shows there. But I think that looking at it now, Magneto in that arc has no idea what he's doing. It's not really that Magneto wants to go and commit mass murder. It's not really that Magneto wants to have a fascist army and conquer the cities and whatever. Every step of the way, he feels like he has to. Like this is what's expected of him by the younger generation or by other people. That it's and he has an entity inside of him that is telling him, that entity, that Sublime. What Sublime does is prey on your insecurities and play on your emotions. And so a lot of that is it's an old man, and they make a big deal. They physically draw Magneto as old for the first time ever, basically, in that he's not all barrel chested and whatever. And they make a big deal of he's old and he's tired and he's not quite with it. He just really wants to be with it. And the way that the younger generation are telling him to be with it is be this genocidal murder machine, so would I like a Magneto like that all the time? No. Do I like that they did it for an arc and it's really hard? Yes, because I always hold stuff against Magneto. I'm the only X-fan I know who, when people bring up Magneto and they're like, Magneto was right, Magneto tried his best. And I'm like, Magneto tried to pimp out children and hired human armies to fight his war and enslaved people and was in eugenics exercises, right? He goes to the Savage Land and he's enslaving people in the Savage Land. And he's performing experiments on them to make them better slaves, basically. And I really hold that against the character. I can't get over, if you have a character who made slaves, that's kind of it for me. I'm like, that character, they're a bad person, even if I enjoy them. And I really like, I just read a bunch of New Mutants again recently, the Wheezy run. And I like that Magneto looks deranged in some of those, and he's very emotional. Like, he's always like just about to lose his temper. The New Mutants, the kids ran away, and Emma Frost and Sebastian Shaw are making fun of him because his kids ran away and he can't run his school. And he looks like he's just gonna lose it, and he doesn't. He doesn't lose it. He holds it together. And so I like that aspect. I like that Magneto is a rounded character and that he has this background that is very complex. And it gets more complex. The more things they add to his backstory, it doesn't cheapen it for me. It just gets more complex. And you're like, you can't psychoanalyze him, even like you can psychoanalyze some, fictional characters, because there's just too much going on there. But I appreciate Planet X, that X-Men arc, new X-Men arc, in that it was the end of supervillain Magneto. We never got that again, and we probably never will. If they try to sell us that right now, I'm calling it now, it's going to fail. If by the end of Trial or whatever, they try to do a blah ha ha with him again, it's going to bomb. Nobody's going to want it, because we haven't wanted it. We didn't want it then. And even though I really liked it, I'm glad that we had 20 more years of, we just never approached that again.
Well, and contextually, Bwahaha Magneto works in the Morrison run, just in the grander narrative of things. But no, I 100% agree with you. If they try to do that sort of a heel turn now, it's going to be a colossal backfire. So, Duna, Gabriel, hey,
Hi. So I'm a bit of an odd man out when it comes to New X-Men, because I read it after the case. I read it all in one go, and it never sat right with me for a whole multitude of reasons, some of which you had mentioned. Just the oddly consistent, like, kind of sexualized tone to it just felt weird to me, and I didn't like it, but I was unaware of the context of the porn push of the time. I don't like how it addresses continuity. It's kind of very self-contained. And it might be because I didn't read those Magneto, genocide, slavery, eugenic stories. But for me to take a character that at this point has already had that Malcolm X allegory pressed on it, and then make this heel turn, it didn't sit well. And I also, at this point, I never read good Magneto in the New Mutants. I honestly, when I first read New X-Men, I didn't know that he was ever good. So I was expecting a villain Magneto. I just wasn't expecting this level of villain Magneto.
Gotcha.
And a lot of New X-Men, to me personally, and I know that I'm the weird man out, it felt very like forced edgy to me. Like, it needed to be dark, so we needed Magneto to murder a child, and a lot of it didn't sit with me. And the Beast coming out, it also set me off very badly, because it felt mocking. And my memory might be hazy. I've not read New X-Men in a really long time, but I could have sworn that in that conversation with Scott, when he's saying you're not gay, his response is, well, I might as well be. I'm as gay as any mutant. And
he does say, I'm as gay as the next mutant.
And this is after North Star has come out, and roughly around, I don't know timeline, roughly around the same time as actually North Star is an X-Men in Chuck Austin's run.
Yeah. No, you're right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it felt like, and I could be making this up as I do many things, but I thought that I saw an interview from Chuck Austin that he said he did that because he wanted to show you could be flamboyant without being gay. And it felt very mocking to me. So I have a lot of negative feelings about New X-Men. Thus my silence.
Yeah, it's okay. No, it's good. Two things I do want to address in that. The first is the Malcolm X thing, which has always bothered me. The weird thing with the Malcolm X thing is it doesn't show up anywhere in record until that first X-Men movie. Bryan Singer says it with the first X-Men movie, and then Stan Lee says, well, I always said it. And some people vaguely remember he said it at some point, but no, you can't concrete. There's no written or recorded record of that until 2000 or 2001 in that first X-Men movie. And so they weren't really working with that in mind, if this is, Malcolm X, which goes back to the liberal bigotry thing that Morrison really wanted to tackle, is this should be about liberal bigotry, because that's who was reading it, were lefties and liberals, right? And so, for the most part, Scott Lobdell is famously very happy that some white supremacists came up to him at a con and told him they could really self-identify with the X-Men. And to him, that shows how the X-Men reaches everyone. To me, that shows that Scott Lobdell had white supremacist fans and he didn't kick them out away from his table. So, we just approached that a little differently there. So there were some hard right X-Men fans out there. But yeah, the Malcolm X thing really wasn't, I think, on the mind as much as it has been since. Once Bryan Singer said that, it's now in all our heads, and we really have that in there. So doing it now, I think, would be a lot harder for that, especially. As far as the coming out aspect goes, I have no issue with people who took that very hard or were offended. In that respect, the way that it bothered you, I absolutely get that. And I have I won't argue that, because I can completely see that reading. I think we saw with Grant Morrison coming out very publicly was it last year or this year?
I think last.
I think it was
like tail end of last.
3 years ago, wasn't it?
So, it was definitely mid-pandemic. So I don't know if it was 2020, if it was late 2020 or early 2021, but it was definitely within the past year.
But everyone kind of knew, so that's
everyone kind of knew. And one of the things I think that had happened, though, is that there were periods where they were more open about things. And then there were periods where they would say things, well, I'm not really that anymore, or I don't really do that as much anymore. But then people saw them out where they were living or at cons, and they were like, yeah, you are. And so not to judge them, because we all make our decisions, and we all, I don't think it's a malicious, I don't think it's we're not representatives. Living our lives, none of us can be representative of everything. And the way that we talk about these things has to do with ourselves, family, and work, but also with the vocabulary that we have at the time. And one of the reasons that Morrison said they came out as publicly as they have now is that they feel comfortable with the terminology that they have now, which I think is, a very good thing for our future, and for, in a time where we all feel right now that things are really terrible and things are really low, and they are, there's at least some positive things going on. But I think at the time, people were able to latch onto certain things and try to push Morrison out of queer conversations. Howard Chaykin, in particular, right around that same time or just before, had done an interview where Morrison had criticized them for their demonization of trans women. And Howard Chaykin's thing was all, well, they have no room to talk. It's not their business. I know lots of trans women. And I like a lot of Howard Chaykin comics. I think Howard Chaykin is a very good artist and very smart. That's really disgusting. And when you talk about why do people stay closeted in comics, or why aren't people louder? And a lot of times when I bring up older comics talent who were out queer publicly, or even out queer quietly, professionally, they're like, I never knew. That's why. because there are people like Howard Chaykin who will go publicly and say things like, you're not allowed to even criticize demonization of somebody because, oh, put your cards on the table. And nobody has to put the cards on the table. That's not your business. And it's not a deflection from you wrote or drew a homophobic or transphobic comic. You still made a transphobic comic. It doesn't stop because somebody, one of the examples I always go to in life is John Byrne, to bring John Byrne back. There's a comic that came out in the late 90s or late 80s or early 90s that John Byrne tried to stop coming out because it was racist. And it was written by someone who was very famous for being anti-racism and very progressive in the representation. The comic came out. It's a racist comic. Full stop, end of story. It's a racist comic. John Byrne, for the first time in his life, was 100% right in that instance. And so to me, it doesn't matter who says it. If they say this is bigoted and we can look at it and be like, yeah, it's bigoted, it was bigoted, right? Nobody has to prove, John Byrne doesn't have to prove his ethnicity to say something is racist. If he is a white guy that says it's racist and we all look at it and say, yeah, it's racist, it was racist. So same thing, I think, with that era and Morrison. There was a real pushback with Morrison to try to oust them from queer spaces in comics or in comics conversations that I think taints the way some people read that or address it.
One thing that I will say when I'm talking about like how that coming out doesn't set me, the scene, the way it's worded, the way it was followed up, a lot of it just, I don't like it. But that being said, in the context of Morrison and their own journey and what they've shared about their journey, it does make sense. Since, like you said, Morrison, when they came out, it was a lot to do with finally finding a term that fit. And Beast coming out or not coming out or whatever all of that was, it was a lot about what the term gay means and what weight that holds. And I can definitely see that writing this story could have been a very big part of Morrison's journey to finding their own identity. But what ended up on panel, not something I like, but I can respect that they had a journey to go through.
No, it's definitely, it's people screwing up. I mean, Beast doesn't mean to say it when he says it. He doesn't really know how to handle it. His friends are not being helpful. The press is not being helpful. So
is the press ever?
Well, I mean, we had stories where Trish Tilby, for the last 10 years before that, had really been a voice of reason in X-Men comics. She was kind of the human who was with it, or the human who could hang out with mutants, which is really condescending in a lot of ways and a problem on its own. And the fact that she heel turned for her career is not surprising, in context. I think at the time people were really upset with her as well, because she'd been Beast's girlfriend for 10 years, even though they never have scenes together. It didn't add anything for them to be dating, really, in any comic for 10 years at least. But it was a stable thing. It was a thing we expected. And so I think in context, we expected better of her. I think some people expected better of Cyclops, and Morrison will say Cyclops is their favorite X-Men to write on that. And the X-Men, they really saw their younger self in a lot of ways. And I can kind of take that a lot of directions, because their Cyclops is a mess. Scott is a mess in that run. I think they come out of that run in a lot of positive ways. And there are parts of that run I wish had stayed. Like at the end of that run, Cyclops is in control of his power. He's able to turn on and off his I-beams, regardless of whether or not he's wearing his special glasses. I'd like that to stick around, especially because it's used as a metaphor in that for self-control and him refusing to take self-control, which, okay, go ahead and take self-control. But it's also a physical disability. His I-beam issue, I mean, he's always going to have the I-beam, but the reason he can't control it is because he has a brain injury, right? He got hit on the head. He fell out of a plane. He got hit in the head. And so he has this brain injury that also included migraines. There's an anecdote somewhere that Morrison was not allowed to bring up the migraines again. They just weren't allowed to let him have headaches. during that run. And it makes me wonder how I would have read Cyclops in that run if they were also suffering from migraines the whole time. They're feeling uncertain and all this stuff, but they also got headaches and can't focus. So I would have liked to see that go through. There are certain follow-throughs on these characters. I would have liked to see Cyclops, Wolverine, and Phantom X in the story, or Gambit when it was still going to be Gambit, wake up after drinking whiskey all night and be like, hey, we're all in bed, what happened? And Gambit or Phantom X is like, what happened? It's, but the other two are, whatever happens. I would like to see it. I would like to see him push, we were at a point where Marvel had background characters or had stories in B-list books. They hadn't really had an A-list queer story at Marvel. And so they could have pushed these things. They could have done these. Apparently they couldn't, because the upper levels, and Bill Jemas especially, were incredibly conservative. And the reason that I think people didn't read it as conservative at the time is because 9/11 made us culturally very right-wing in a lot of ways that we didn't understand at the time. And also they hammered down on the eroticization of women. And you look at that Marvel comic that Jemas wrote, where it was bikini covers all the time, or these kind of that was the atmosphere. And I think people read that at the time as that means they're not conservative because there's all these porny covers and this sort of thing. But there were comics where everyone is super straight and the guys are always super clothed, and there's very rigid gender identity stuff. So I can understand in retrospect what Morrison was up against, what some of the artists were up against that I didn't know at the time. The origin story of X23, if you don't know, the origin story of X23 is disgusting. It is absolutely disgusting and disturbing. X23 was originally going to be a young girl who is, a Wolverine clone or daughter of Wolverine, but her name will be X32 because when you flip X32 upside down, it says sex. And they're going to make her this child prostitute in the city, which is she is in NYX, but her name will be a visual pun to flip over and be sex. And,
it's,
so this is what that arc was running against. I really appreciate a lot of the Austin run. I like Chuck Austin as a person. I think he's a good guy. I think he means well for the most part. There are arcs that he did. There are stories that he did that I don't agree with, representational things I don't agree with. She-Hulk having sex with her client during a long arc in his X-Men, I have issues with. But him dealing with queer characters and just calling them gay or just having conversations like normal people have conversations, that was groundbreaking for X-Men. That was very different than anything we had had before. So being up against the Austin run, I think is actually good for New X-Men much more than it was ever negative, even though in fan memory, the Austin run was all trash and it was terrible and it blah, blah, blah. And for me, I think they complemented each other very well in that, and that the Austin run actually showed some things that the New X-Men run could have done better under better circumstances.
okay, so before moving on them, I feel like I don't want to spend too much time talking about Magneto here, but Jeremy left a comment about Magneto. I can either read it or saw it. I can saw it. And I just want to say to this comment that Claremont never intended the Malcolm X reading of Magneto at all, but he did intended for Magneto to be kind of like the Prime Minister of Israel at the time. So it was kind of criticism still. It was still a villainy role, but it was a complicated villainy role. And that was way more in line with what Claremont intended than any Malcolm X reference. It was more about someone turning into oppression after being oppressed than Black revolutionaries. That was not it. So that's something that I wanted to add to that. But going back to New X-Men, I think I have like 3 more things to ask before we go, but Matt or Gabriel can add anything. And one is about the art, and I'm just curious about what of the artists that are in this are all of you more fun about or whatever, because I have my favorite, which is Phil Jimenez, but I'm curious.
Either one, you going to go first?
Oh, Phil. It's Phil Jimenez. That's my favorite
Phil.
artist. I mean, to this day, Phil Jimenez is one of my favorite artists, and I think that they did just some career best work on New X-Men, which is saying a lot because what a resume. But one of the things that really, the first 3 issues were all drawn by Frank Quitely. And, getting back to what we were talking earlier in the conversation about the book just looking different than anything else on the stand, that's down to Quitely. And, this wasn't the first time that Morrison had worked with Frank, but this certainly felt, at least to me, like the perfect team to be tackling this iteration and this idea of what the X-Men could become. And, some of the later artists, I know everyone talked about Igor Cordy was supposed to have been the next best thing. And then I don't know what happened to Igor Cordy, but Igor Cordy just kind of went away. But there's some good, solid stuff in here throughout the run. Unfortunately, we have someone I'll only refer to as EVS that did a handful of issues in there, and that taints the run a little bit, just because he's such a despicable human being. But I mean, it's a pretty and clean and just eye-popping book, really, from start to finish.
I have to say, there's one story that I haven't read because I can't stand the art, and it's Chris Bad Shadows. I can't. Like, it's just like butts and tits, and I just can't with that one. But that's the one I haven't read.
No, I think my taste is very weird for an X fan. I always feel like that with a lot of our primary fandoms, like the X fans, the Spider fans, but in terms of New X-Men, my absolute favorite art are the 2 super rushed issues that Igor Corday did. One of which he had to draw in days, and I love that it just looks like somebody drew it in a couple of days. I think that Hi-Fi, who did the color for most of the run, really outdid themselves. They really stepped up their game in this, especially in that first arc where the blood is red blood, which we had not seen red blood in an X-Men comic in I don't know how long. It was always blood traditionally in X-Men comics or in comics under the code was colored black. You just ink it in and that's blood. And what they did is color it bright red, and Quitely had drawn big globules of blood or spray of blood. That's impactful to me. Like, I remember reading those issues the first time. That's what got my attention. But Quitely had this beautiful design sense, and everything was very centered and very tactile. So I love Quitely. I love Phil's work. In one of the article chapters coming up, or one of the series chapters coming up, I talk about at the time that this was coming out in trades, I had gotten a trade, and I was living with a guy who in LA, and he was reading it, and he flips between where it's Quitely having drawn Cyclops taking his shirt off and being found out that he's having this affair. And the next issue, which opens up in the next thing, it's Phil Jimenez has drawn it, and his Cyclops is not as built, and he looks very nervous, and he's afraid because he just got caught cheating. And so the guy he looks at it, he says, well, that's it. Cyclops just went from my type to not my type in one page. And I love that if one artist had drawn those 2 pages, it wouldn't have the same impact. Even if they used a completely different style, their approach would still be there. And so I actually think New X-Men benefits from having more than one artist at times. Not that it has to have pinch hitters who have pinch hitters. Things were running very late and very difficult with New X-Men. In Morrison's contract, the original contract, which was apparently this fantastic contract that never happened. They had choice of their artist. They were able to recommend artists, but they also had final say on who was the artist. That never happens because the very first pinch hitter artist was someone they didn't want. It was never passed by them. It was never an issue with it, never drawn by them. They didn't want it when it happened. So that happens. It was in the contract that Frank Quitely was going to draw the whole comic, which was, I think initially was only going to be a year or 2 years. But Frank Quitely was going to draw the whole thing, and deadlines didn't matter. That goes away before the first issue even comes out because they've got the pinch hitter on before the first issue even came out. And so there are things going on there that complicated the scheduling, complicated how do I approach this? And so that's when we start to see much more the mini arcs, and then there's an issue between the mini arcs or these sort of catch-up games doing artists. So that gets complicated. But I think Igor Corday was great. I think he was beautiful when he's rushed, even though I'm sure it bothers him, and I know it bothered other people. I don't like his treatment on that comic. He was blackmailed. He was really press ganged into doing New X-Men. You're going to draw these issues, and there's 2 issues where he draws them each like within less than a week. You're going to do these or we won't give you any more work. And he's got kids. He's got a family. They had just moved the family all to the U.S., and so he felt he had to do it, which is why post New X-Men, he basically leaves Marvel alone and is mostly done European comics since. And he's had a great career since, and I hope he's very happy with that. And it's a lot more relaxing because that's a really atrocious way to treat a human being, as a company. So the Bachalo run, there are parts of the art I like. There's things I have issues with. I really like Quitely. I really like Phil. I really like John Paul Leon and Bill Sienkiewicz together. And they do 2 issues. And the first issue they have to make us believe lies because the narrator of that issue is lying to us and to other characters the entire issue. And so they have to draw something that when we realize it's lies, we can go back and look at and see, we can see they're lying. But that while we're reading it the first time, we completely believe what we are seeing and what we are reading are the same thing. And so that's a huge task to ask an artist. And I love that. I love the art in that issue. The next issue that they do together, they are doing a callback to the 80s, and it's a much stronger 80s vibe. And I don't know which of the artists brought that, if it's the penciler or the inker or just the 2 of them together. But it really feels to me, even reading it in the omnibus and it's in the middle of the other issues, it feels like an old comic that got slipped in. They really nailed that for me. So I love their 2 issues together.
So I hate to poop on the party, guys, but my laptop is about to die. I've got to jump out. But Travis, Donna, Gabriel, it's been great talking with you guys today. I will see you all in chat, and fare thee well, gang. Thank you so much for all of your insight, Travis. As ever, it's always illuminating.
Thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Gabriel, do you have anything to say about the art, or?
I'll be honest, I don't. Like I said, I read New X-Men all in one big run, and when I read it was also before I started really recognizing names. So I couldn't really pick out artists or runs and things like that.
So I didn't see a lot, but I also don't want to spend a lot of time on like we are already in almost 2 hours. But I really like Phil's art here, and I feel like it's very like human. Like it really feels like he gets like even the lines on the faces. I think it's really brilliant that they don't look like superheroes a lot at some points. They just look like people, and that's something really beautiful for me. And the last thing that I want to ask you, Travis, is more like what we're gonna see in the future in the column, because this column has a lot to go yet. Like it's gonna have a few chapters, and generally a general vision of what is gonna happen, or some of the things that you're excited about to happen in the column, and also about the issue, the article that is gonna be on Billy Joel's Glass Houses. That is an article kind of in music and in pop culture reference and all that stuff. That I kind of want you to expand a little bit of that, because I think people would be interested in like this take of like comparing superhero stuff to albums all the time, and that's great.
Yeah, so coming up in the book, we have, it's hard for me because I, of course, wrote most of it previously, and it's been a while submitting, and then it sits there. And so some of the things that are coming up, though, definitely gets more biographical with me. I start to talk more about where I was at the time, how these comics affected me or affected people around me, what they were representing really in the culture of the time. Doing this book and looking at New X-Men again has really helped me appreciate how we were in those years in ways that I didn't think about at the time and that I wasn't aware of. Like when we talk about New X-Men now, and it's very sexual and very sex conscious, and I realized at some point, like, yeah, like internet porn had become a thing for the first time. And all my friends, when I started to think about my friends and jobs, I was like, we all worked for the military in some way, or we all did like media stuff, or a lot of my friends were in porn. I was in some calendars at the time, and did some things with Annie Sprinkles at the time. So, you know, and people would still find things and bring them out. So that was where we were at culturally and atmospherically. These things we were just becoming aware. Like if you take risque pictures for somebody, or let your, you know, significant other, you know, your partner or some drunk person you were with at the time take a picture of you, like it doesn't just come in the physical form anymore. Like suddenly it's everywhere. So sex consciousness in that way was part of the culture. This militarization and this sort of toughening up really was. Everybody I know, like, that, you know, my generation or a little bit older remembers when we would go to protests at the time and everybody got beat up. I got beat up by the police at protests. I got beat up by police outside of my work during that time. And we all kind of got used to that. Like that was really, police violence was really a thing, you know, in a way that it had not been publicly. It had always been there. It's always going to be there. But you could go to protests in the late 90s and there was more of a chance that you weren't going to get arrested or you weren't going to get hit. And suddenly with 9/11 happening and everything, they would just shoot the tear gas grenade at your head kind of thing. And so I'm becoming aware of that. So I talk about that and more about just the political situation, the awareness in there. The Billy Joel article grew out of two things that I realized with New X-Men is that New X-Men is grounded really in systems, and that when we were reading it at the time, that was a big thing people like to pick apart. We're like, what are these systems? Grant Morrison likes to use lists or notebooks to make up their plots or make up their ideas. And so there are arcs like Riot at Xavier's where they just made lists of everything that really impacted them in other school stories. And then they would just throw those out or combine them. And that became Riot at Xavier's. It's basically a remix of the things in other school stories that really affected them. And so you can break that back down into that list, or you can break those arcs down into the movies that they're interested in or the movies they're referring to. And so it's a good way, and analytically, we like to do that. We like to, I think critics and analysts like to break things back down into these categories or into these systems. So I wanted to approach that. And also, we like, and in New X-Men, there's a real sense of home and security. It's the first time the school is a completely functional boarding school with multiple classes and multiple levels and multiple grades. That had never happened before. People are coming and finding their home with the X-Men. They're finding their home at that school or in the team. And there's a real sense of that. Whereas earlier, storylines, like when the new X-Men of the time in the 70s come, Storm and Nightcrawler and so on, we see the older X-Men tell them to leave, basically. They all tell them to take a hike. We don't need you here. We don't want you living here. I live here. You don't live here. And that's kind of the traditional X-Men way to respond to these people. When Rogue joins, they're very, yeah, we'll see how you do, you know. And I think only Charles is like, no, she lives here now. So New X-Men was big in that way. It wasn't just one group coming in and it's their home. It was on different levels. And so I thought about systems and home. How do I do this? And I was like, I'll pick something that is not related to it at all. And Billy Joel's Glass Houses, Morrison didn't sit down, Frank Quietly, Phil Jimenez did not sit down and be like, I'm going to model this on Glass Houses. So I picked something that was completely absurd on both levels to see then what can I get out of it if I treat it like it's really part of it or really part of the structure. What can I get out that's useful? What can I get out that feels real? And what can I get out that, what can I say, it just doesn't line up at all. It's ridiculous. And so it was to kind of take apart a lot of the analysis I had done earlier. And am I just talking shit the whole time? I'm just going to talk shit here. And there were parts that I thought, oh, I can do this. This is about hypocrisy. There's so much hypocrisy in New X-Men. I can do that perfectly. I came to the song All for Lena, and I was like, the hell am I going to do? I didn't know, am I going to talk about Lena? And just by chance, I realized there's a Lena in New X-Men, and it's Darkstar, and she gets murdered in the story. And it's a big moral issue between characters of whether or not that was a justified killing. Was her funeral enough? Did she deserve a funeral at all? It's really a backbone about how they talk about death and how they talk about the not famous mutants. And I was able to talk about that only because Billy Joel had a song on the album called All for Lena. And I have to then spend a section talking about how to find somebody. So it sort of allowed me to show that, yes, some of this analysis, you're really reaching, you're stretching sometimes. And other times it's there, you need an opportunity to think about it. You need a chance to think about it. And I think when a lot of critics, or when a lot of, not critics, when a lot of readers or audience look at criticism, or even when critics look at other critics' work, a lot of times when we say, oh, they're reaching, or they're just making that up, that's not anywhere in it. Sometimes it's true. A lot of times they saw it because it was of concern to them, whether it's of concern to them their whole life or it's the concern to them at that moment. That's why they saw it. If they're worried about the financial aspect of X-Men, or they're worried about the gender aspect of X-Men or the sexuality, it's because in that moment, it was a concern to them. They picked up on it, or they saw that as a stronger element because of that. And that's completely okay. It's not invalid in that way. I've been guilty of that myself sometimes, and saying, well, somebody just made this up, or somebody saw this in there and it's not there. It was there. It was there enough that they saw it. So Glass Houses was me kind of representing that and also coming to terms with that.
That's pretty cool. So I think let's wrap it up here. And okay. That was great. Like,
thank you very much.
Yes. I'm kind of interested in reading it like from start to finish now, because I have never done that, only arcs, and I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, I'm interested. I wish we had more time to talk with you about how your read was of reading it in arcs, and Gabriel, how your read was reading it all one go through. I have done both at different times, but it was not how I came into it.
Mm-hmm.
So
we all formed our opinion a little bit differently. So it sounds like we'd have an interesting amount of topics to discuss in a part 2.
Sometime down the road, yeah, I think definitely there's a lot more to go on here. If I haven't outed everyone's dirty laundry already, we're all going to get a sternly worded response from John Byrne on his forum.
Okay. Okay. So thank you everyone for watching. we'll see you. Well, I'm not gonna see you the next time because it's in 2 weeks and I'm not gonna be here. But I'm gonna see you all for Prize, which is better even. So
Very good.
yay. We'll say more about that.